Hi there, welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be looking at how we can add color to different kinds of stamp ink. I'm Natasha of Natasha Miller Creates, and this is part 3 of my Stamping in a Bullet Journal series. If you want to catch up, part 1 is about using different inks within your bullet journal, and part 2 is looking at the different quality of stamps, so photopolymer, acrylic, rubber. So you can definitely head on over to those if you want to find out more about stamping in a bullet journal. But today we're going to be looking at adding color to our stamps. Today's ink, we will be using the scrapbook.com premium dye ink. This is easier to find, so I grabbed that to check it out. If you want to see me swatch this in different journals, let me know down in the comments below. I have my favorite pigment ink, which is the VersaFine. Next up, we have a hybrid ink, which is a combination of pigment ink and dye ink. Different hybrid inks have different formulas. This one that I'm using today tends to be more pigmented. And then we have the StazOn, which is a solvent ink. I really do like this ink. It does stamp on anything, but to see how that works in a bullet journal, you can go check out my first video. Now for coloring, we're going to be looking at watercolor, colored pencils. I've got my Tombow brush pens that we'll be using. And then I have Copic alcohol markers. There are lots of different alcohol markers on the market. I don't use them that much. These are actually from quite a few years ago. They still work, so we're going to give these a try. And then the idea is we're going to see how these different mediums work with these different inks. So initially I was going to show you how these guys work using cardstock. But as you know, it's more important to test these in your actual journal that you're going to be using. So while the cardstock was nice, and even though I had it all printed out and it's all pretty, I'm actually going to do it with my bullet journal. Now, I used an Archer and Olive 160 GSM notebook. I do recommend that you test it in your own notebook, but given the thickness of the Archer and Olive paper, you should get a good idea if you're using a bullet journal that has thinner paper than 160 GSM. So let's get going on how these different mediums are going to work with these different stamp inks. Okay, so I have my layouts all set up, and we'll be starting with the watercolor and the pencils. We have our dye ink, our pigment ink, our hybrid ink, and our solvent ink. And I'm going to be using a stamp from the Garden Treasures, which is an Altenew set. They are layering stamps, so you can layer them with stamping. But of course, I'm showing you how to color today. Initially, I was going to include paint pens, but honestly, paint pens just color over top of the ink, so there's no real reaction that happens. So we'll be sticking to watercolor, colored pencils, brush pens, and alcohol markers. So I'm going to stamp with each of the inks, and I'll be cleaning the stamp in between stamping so that there's no transfer of the different formulas. And then we will give it some dry time and we will get going. So quick refresher, your dye ink is water-based, your pigment ink has a thicker, creamier formula, and then your hybrid ink is a combination of the two. As I touched on, different hybrid inks have different formulas. I find the Distress Oxide inks to be a little bit more of a pigment ink, and then of course the solvent ink is more of an alcohol-based ink. Now granted, I stamped a little bit like a monster, so the stamp slipped a little when I first put it down, but your dye ink is going to give you thin, crisp lines. Your pigment ink is going to give you slightly thicker lines. Your hybrid ink is going to do what it does. That's part of the fun of a hybrid ink. And as you can see, the color's not evenly distributed. That's the nature of a hybrid ink. That's what you're going to get. And then the solvent ink tends to be crisp, but it's going to have a little bit of those thicker lines, just like a pigment ink. So I think that was about 5 minutes of dry time. If we go through, none of the ink smudged. So we're going to get going and start adding some color. So we're going to start with the watercolor. I'm just using the Prisma Marketing Ink watercolors, and I'm just starting off with activating the watercolor, and then we can get going. Now the 160 GSM notebooks do handle water quite well, but that doesn't mean I'm going to want to plop down a bunch of water in the notebook. So I am going very fast, but also careful with adding the color. So there we have our color. Please don't mind my awful painting. I just needed to get color on the page. So the stamp inks held up pretty well to the watercolor, especially the dye ink, which surprises me given that the dye ink is a water-based formula. So I'm wondering the premium of the premium dye ink is actually more of a hybrid. I don't know. They tend to be very obviously secretive over the formulas of the different stamps, so it's really hard to find out more information of what's actually percentages of the formula. So it held up really nice. It didn't help that I stamped like a bit of a monster, so that it was harder to tell if there was any bleeding, but honestly, as I was painting, I was looking for it and there was none. With that said, if you're painting over a dye ink, you're going to want to test it first just to make sure that the dye ink that you have isn't going to bleed with the watercolor. The pigment ink did great, which is expected because there are different formulas. Hybrid ink did well. Again, hybrid ink, it depends on the percentage of the formula, so definitely test it out. And then the solvent ink did great because it's more of an alcohol base, so it's definitely not going to react with the water. So now we're going to get into the pencils. What I want you to look for when we're doing the pencils is to see if there's any smudging as you're coloring over the lines or near the lines. It's part of the reason why I chose this stamp set, so that we can go in and add color over top of the little stamens, I'm gonna say. I think that's right. But as we add color, you're going to see if there's any smudging. And then we will be going over the top of the pencil with a blender pencil. And that's also where you're going to see maybe a little bit of smudging on the ink. I am finding that these inks dry pretty quickly and really well. Again, you're going to want to test it on your own paper first. This is the Ocher and Olive paper that I'm finding is actually holding up really well. Okay, so I'm going to be using the Prismacolor Premier colored pencils and then a Prismacolor Premier colorless blender pencil. Again, I'm cleaning the stamps in between each of the inks so that there's no ink transfer. Okay, so those are ready to go. I'm giving it about a 5-minute dry time. The solvent ink is a bit sticky. I think it's just because my stamp pad is getting old, but I accidentally dropped it as I was lifting it, so that's what that marking is. It's not really indicative of how the pencils are working. And since I stamped this one better, as you can see, it's a lot clearer image than the pigment ink. This is a favorite of stampers in general, the dye ink, and you'll see why as we get to one of our other coloring mediums that we'll be using. Okay, so let's take a closer look and see. The dye ink held up pretty well. There is some smudging in the middle of the black ink of the stamen. So that's if that's something that really concerns you, if you're coloring in a highly detailed stamp, you can go in and around it. The point of this video was to show you how the different mediums act, so I wasn't being too careful so that you got a better idea. The pigment ink, I would say the pigment ink held up the best to the blending and the color pencil. There's a little bit of black smudging, but not as much as the dye ink. The hybrid ink did really well as well. Again, only a little bit of smudging. I would actually say less so than the pigment, so the hybrid ink was great. And then the solvent ink actually turned out to be a giant mess. There is black ink smudging everywhere. The texture is rough. Solvent ink does not like colored pencils. So the next two coloring mediums we're going to look at are brush pens and alcohol markers. Again, I'll be using Tombos as those are the most common in our community. And then for alcohol markers, I'm going to be using Copics. Now, in general, I would never use alcohol markers directly in my notebook. I am reinforcing my pages so that there's no bleed through, but I do want to show you how the different inks work on the paper specifically, even though realistically I'm never going to use alcohol markers in my notebook. I just really want to emphasize that point because it will bleed through and it will ruin a few pages into your notebook. Okay, so we're going to give this a little bit more dry time. Again, what you're going to want to watch for is any bleeding of the stamp ink and if the markers get any black on the tips. I'm going to grab an extra piece of paper to show you if the markers do pick up any of the black ink. Okay, so for the brush pens, yes, I did stamp my dye ink like a monster, but there was a little bit of smudging in the black, especially as I added more layers. Now, I wanted to make sure I was coloring the images in like I would color them in if this was a journal setup. So when I went in to layer over top of colors, it was fine on the single lines, but where there was a lot more detail in the ink, that's where I saw more smudging. The pigment ink did really well. There was little to no smudging anywhere, so that was great. And that makes sense because the brush pens are water-based, the pigment ink isn't, so chemically speaking, it should be fine. So the hybrid ink was an interesting reaction. As you can see, the black actually faded quite a bit when I added the yellow, and I did go in kind of rough on the yellow, so lots of detail there, and there was definite fading and a little bit of smudging. I did clean the tip. You can't really see the black streaks, but there is some smudging in there. And then the solvent ink, which is alcohol based, did really well with the brush pens. Again, didn't stamp too clean in the middle there, but that's what it looked like before. So solvent ink and the brush pens are a great combination. So now we're going to go into the alcohol markers and we're going to see how they do with the different inks. I feel like I should have done a disclaimer on most of it, but please don't judge my coloring based on what you're seeing. It's a fine line between trying to color neatly, trying to get the video done so that you're not sitting here forever, and then of course trying to be as realistic as possible. And it's just, and then I have a cat that's trying to get involved in this video, so it's very eventful. So giving these guys a bit of time to dry, I'm grabbing my paper again so that you can see if there's any transfer onto the markers. So those are the alcohol markers. I wish I could use these in my journal more because they just glide on the page, but that's why you don't use alcohol markers in journals. Okay, so dye ink did really well, no transfer. It does look a bit blurry. I think if you leave the ink to dry a little bit longer, that's going to be perfect. Pigment ink, a little bit more smudging. Pigment ink, I mean, it's okay. Lost a bit of color, lots of smudging, some transfer. The hybrid ink wasn't too bad either, reacted similar to the pigment ink, which makes sense since technically there is some pigment ink in that formula. Now, the solvent ink, which again is an alcohol-based ink, did not work. Which makes sense because the alcohol formula from the alcohol inks definitely reactivated the stamp, and that is why you had so much smudging there. Okay, so that's how the different kinds of coloring mediums work with the different kinds of stamping. I hope you enjoyed today's video. We'll talk about tips and tricks to help you be a better stamper in your bullet journal. Thank you for watching today, and I'll see you in the next one. For more bullet journaling content, make sure to check out one of the 2 videos below. I'll see you over there.